Greetings once again. No Viking would go raiding without his sword. And you can't have a sword without a scabbard. So since you can't just carry your sword around like some sort of uncultured barbarian, threw together the scabbard using scrap wood that I had been laying around for a while. Most of it is 1/8 inch thick hardwood plywood, leather wrapped, and the two pieces at the ends are steel that have been brass transferred to look weathered and tarnished, offered a little bit more protection, and jazz it up a little bit. When I make the belt system, I'm going to make the harness for this. I'll probably use something that connects it from several different points. I'll have something here and then a piece here to help keep it a little better balanced. It's a little on the thick side and a little on the wide side, but it had to be for the sword, and it needed to be 1/4 inch thick so that the sword would actually fit in it, because it doesn't do any good to have a scabbard that the sword doesn't fit in. All I've got left is the belt and the tunic, the pants, the helmet. Not anywhere near as close to being done as I thought I was. See you next week. So I started out tracing the blade onto the oak plywood, and then cutting the end section off just so it was a little easier to work with. And in an effort to keep the scabbard as small as was possible, I just added an extra 1/4 of an inch all the way around, and those are going to be the little spacers to give me the 1/4 inch thickness for the blade to go in. A couple of straight edges to make the lines, and then I sort of hand drew in about what I was expecting the tip was going to look like. Then I moved to the metal cutting bandsaw and cut the pieces out. I wasn't particularly concerned about making sure that the lines were straight and perfect, because, well, it's going to get sanded. Once I had the first side cut out, I did the same thing with another piece. I then took a scrap piece of hardwood that just happened to be 1/4 inch thick and divided it into two pieces, and I'm going to use those for the spacers between the two pieces of plywood, and this will make up the space in the middle so that there's room for the blade. And then some more of that same hardwood, and I just sort of scabbed in the end pieces as best I could to make them fit as nice as possible. It involved a little freehanding and mishmashing and matching parts, but eventually I got it squared away. And once I had all the spacer pieces cut to appropriate sections and lengths, I started gluing everything together. Just start one side at a time, lay the pieces in, flip the board over, put a couple of staples in it to hold it temporarily, and then flip it back over and do the other side. At this stage, this thing's looking pretty ugly, but I think I've mentioned my grinding skills in other videos, and I'm not normally one to brag, but my sanding skills they're about as good as my grinding skills. So in the end, this will all be taken care of. Once everything was glued together and temporarily stapled, I used a whole bunch of different angle iron and angle aluminum and clamps to just hold everything together and set it aside overnight. Next morning, I got up and started the rough grinding process, and all this was just getting all of the really nasty rough edges and knocking down the corners a little bit. Once I had some of the rough sanding done, I went through and pulled all of the staples out. I don't want to take a chance that they get wet and then leak through the leather wrap on this, so I needed to take them out, but I wanted them in there when I was gluing it together. And then a quick test fit before moving on to the next stage. So I did some measuring to cut up a section from this green chrome-tanned leather that I picked up for Mandalorian vests. Chrome-tanned leather differs from veg-tanned leather in that it's actually a lot more resilient to oopses from, oh, for instance, contact cement and glue. You got a piece of veg tan leather and you make a mistake and get the glue on there, and you may have a problem with dye. Chrome tan mostly wipes right off. Back to the project. Cut the leather down a little bit at the size, make it easier to work with, and traced a line down the center of the scabbard. From there, I laid the leather out and the scabbard on that, rolled the edges back and marked them, then used a straight edge to cut a tapered shape that's going to line up with the line that goes down the center of the scabbard. Then I applied a layer of contact cement to the scabbard and to the leather. Make sure you protect your work surfaces. This stuff can be messy. Once the contact cement had set up a little bit, I lined the edge of the leather against the center line on the scabbard and very slowly and very carefully set the edge. Once I had that done, flipped the scabbard over and repeated the process. I went down the edge, rolled the leather back, marked where I needed the line to be, trimmed the excess off, and then started in the middle of the scabbard because that was where I actually had the least amount of clearance with the leather and the edges. I used a Q-tip to try and get as close to the other leather edge as possible without getting stuff all over it. It'll wipe off, but I really didn't want to get it all over it if I could avoid it. Once the contact cement had set up, I rolled it over and clamped it for a few hours just to let it set up a little bit, and then started working towards the tip of the scabbard without going all the way to the tip, because that's going to have to be darted and cut and darted and cut. So I wanted to do that one last. Same process, contact cement on the scabbard, contact cement on the leather, and then once it started drying, I cut a section out, mark where I needed to dart, because I really am not confident enough in the process to figure it out, but without doing it. So I'd mark where I needed to dart, cut it out with the scissors, and then lay the piece of leather over, and then move on to the next section. Once I had them laying reasonably flat, I'd cut a straight edge, just like the rest of the leather down the center. Eventually, I was able to get this all wrapped up and laying mostly flat. I'm going to cap this with a piece of steel, so I didn't need it to be perfect. I just needed to be smooth enough that I could get the steel cap over top of it. Took it out in the garage and started laying out the patterns for the end cap and the piece that's up near the opening of the scabbard. I just drew something, whatever, cut it out of the cardboard, and then transferred the cardboard to a piece of, well, a couple pieces of 16 gauge sheet metal. I traced the first one out, then cut it out with the bandsaw, and then used that one to make another one, and then cut that one out with a bandsaw. Took the half of the pattern for the top piece, traced out one half, flipped it over, and traced out the other half. Cut the piece out with a bandsaw, and then started using the nibbling process that you've seen in other videos to cut out the curves. Once I had that done, I spent a little bit of time with my good friends, the files, to get the edges cleaned up. Once I had the top metal piece cut out, I centered it on the scabbard, clamped it, and folded the edges around the top of the scabbard. I had to move the clamps a couple of times to get everything finalized, but once I had it all trimmed up, I took it to the welding table and butt welded the two pieces together. Once I had them all welded together, I ground the welds down and then used the sander and some sandpaper to clean up the edges as best possible. I put the two sides of the end cap together, measured the distance, and then traced that onto a piece of sheet metal, and then cut that out on the bandsaw. And I think it ended up being 7/8 of an inch wide. Not that it matters, but just 'cause. Sanded the edges to get it as smooth and square as possible, and then using flux core wire, because I ran out of MIG gas, I proceeded to make this as ugly as possible. Now once I had it all welded together, ground it down, cleaned it up, polished it as best I can,
It's ugly and rainy outside, so I wasn't able to do the brass transfer technique on camera. Sorry. But then brought it in, test fitted everything to make sure that it was going to fit, and trimmed up the scabbard.